Hola. Okay. The year was 2009 in the late summer in Albuquerque, New Mexico. A baby is born and quickly rushed to the ICU. Nurses and doctors are rushing around the unit, giving medication and making interventions. The baby is only 28 weeks old, and he's born a whole 3 months prematurely. Doctors are saying that his lungs are not fully developed and that he will likely spend his life blind. The child is unlikely to survive, and if he does, he will be severely handicapped. See, the baby's only 28 weeks into this world, and it's already being labeled stuff like developmentally delayed, partially blind, or unable to play sports or function as a normal kid. The Old Testament tells a story of somebody else that was labeled. He's not a main character, and you rarely hear Sunday school lessons about him. In 2 Samuel chapter 9, we learn about a man named Mephibosheth. At this point in history, David is the new king of the nation of Israel, and Saul has recently died. One day, King David is sitting on his royal throne and asks counsel if there is still someone living from the house of Saul that he may show the kindness of God to. Surprisingly, the council reports that there is still one son alive, but that he was, quote, crippled in his feet. That's it? So you're telling me that the king asked who this man was and gets crippled in his feet? No name is given, no reputation, just a label, defined by his struggle, recognized by him something that happened to him, described by his condition. And that's what the enemy will try to do. He will label you by your weaknesses or your sin or an event in your life. Mephibosheth was labeled by the lowest day in his life, the day that he was dropped and crippled in his feet. But King David is seemingly unfazed about his labels. In an amazing act of grace and love, the king chooses to summon this man to the palace. If you can imagine this scene, Mephibosheth comes clunking in awkwardly with his old broken crutches, and his feet are dragging across the royal floors as he approaches the throne. His eyes stare at the ground, his feelings of unworthiness pile up inside of him. It only benefits King David to kill Mephibosheth because he is a descendant of Saul. It says in 2 Samuel chapter 9, verse 6, that Mephibosheth fell on his face before the king and asked, "What is your servant heart that you should show regard for a dead dog as I?" A dead dog? So you're telling me that the crippled man was labeled for so long by his weaknesses that he began to call himself by his debilities? This day, however, would not be a day of execution. This would be the day that Mephibosheth would forever lose the label of dead dog or crippled in his feet. Amazingly, King David tells Mephibosheth that he will restore all of his inheritance. The things that this man has considered long lost will now be restored to him. The king will provide servants to help him in farming and to manage his inheritance. King David doesn't stop here. He tells Mephibosheth that he will always have a seat at his table. There will always be a chair for him and a plate with his name card behind it. This is the gospel. Jesus took the labels that were put on us, nailed them to the cross, and took them to the grave. While the enemy tries to label us by our shortcomings, the king tells us that we have an inheritance and a new name. An inheritance, a new name, and a seat forever at his table. The story of Mephibosheth is meaningful to me because the baby in the ICU was me. I was the baby that was born into a world that had nothing but labels prepared for it. Early in my life, I was labeled a lot of things. But God has the authority to restore any past situation. I was labeled developmentally delayed, but I have learned that I can do all things through Christ who gives me strength. I was labeled blind, but God has the authority to call blind men to see again. I was labeled born prematurely, but God's timing is always perfect. I look at my story and the story of Mephibosheth and see how God can do the miraculous, so I trust him with my future. Remember that when the world wants to put labels on you, that you always have a seat at the king's table, and there will always be a chair for you with your name card behind it. Gracias.